The first thing I registered was the cold. Not the sterile, recycled chill of Nexus Station's environmental systems, but the absolute, soul-leeching cold of the void. It clung to the Durasteel deck plates outside Airlock 7, a phantom limb of the vacuum just beyond the triple-sealed bulkhead. My feathers, the fine, silver filaments that lined my primary manipulator limbs and traced the crest atop my head, cinched tight against my exoskeleton. It was a primal reaction, an ancestral memory of windswept Cygnian plains and the predators that hunted in the long shadows of twilight. Inside the shimmering containment field erected by station security, Ambassador Zoran of the Grawl conglomerate was arranged. The Grawl were a ponderous, reptilian species, built for high-gravity worlds and slow, deliberate contemplation. To see one in a state of violent disarray was profoundly unsettling. His thick, scaly hide, normally the color of rich, wet earth, was flash-frozen to a brittle gray slate. Crystalline lattices of frozen methane glittered on his ceremonial robes. His jaw was locked open in a silent roar, a final, futile protest against the indifferent vacuum that had claimed him. The official report was a study in impossibility. Airlock 7's internal and external doors were sealed, both physically and digitally. The logs showed no activity for the past 3 standard rotations. No access codes had been entered, no manual overrides triggered. The maintenance subsystems reported perfect integrity. There were no prints, no stray fibers, no organic residue, nothing. Ambassador Zoran had simply ceased to be inside the station and begun to be outside of it, a feat that defied every known law of physics and station engineering. It was a murder that had left no wound, no weapon, and no entry. It is a logical paradox, I had transmitted to my superiors in the Cygnian diplomatic corps. My role as special aide for interspecies relations was typically one of translation and cultural mediation. This was far beyond my purview. The event has occurred, yet the pathway for the event does not exist. Their response was swift and, for my people, deeply concerning. The Terran Confederacy has been consulted. They are dispatching an inquisitor. You will assist her, observe everything, report everything. An inquisitor. The term itself was archaic, dripping with connotations of zealotry and dogma that made my logical Cygnian mind recoil. The Terrans were the newest, most volatile members of the Galactic Council. They were a whirlwind of contradictory impulses. Breathtaking art and savage brutality, profound empathy and terrifying xenophobia. They were a species of soft-fleshed, bipedal mammals who had clawed their way off a death world brimming with poisons, predators, and geological instability. They were, to put it mildly, an anomaly. And now one of their specialists was coming to solve a paradox. I was waiting at the designated docking bay when her ship, a small, severe-looking craft named the Stillness, latched onto Nexus. The name seemed appropriate when she emerged. Her name was Mara Vex. She was shorter than the average human female, with a compact frame that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her hair was black, pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin at her temples. Her face was a collection of sharp angles, but her most striking feature was her eyes. Most sapient species have eyes positioned for panoramic awareness, the better to spot threats from multiple directions. My own are set wide on my cranial carapace, granting me a 270-degree field of vision. Mara Vex's eyes were set deep in their sockets and pointed directly forward. They were the color of a gas giant storm, and they did not scan, they fixed. They locked onto things with an unnerving, predatory focus. "Kael'ra," she said. Her voice was low, with a strange, resonant lack of inflection. It wasn't robotic, it was simply still. "You are my liaison." "Is correct, Inquisitor Vex," I chirped, my vocal modulator translating the complex vibrations of my syrinx into galactic standard. My crest flared slightly in a gesture of formal greeting. "I have all the preliminary data compiled for your review. Security logs, atmospheric readings, biographical files on all council members and their staff." She held up a hand, a gesture I knew meant stop. "Later, take me to the body." To the scene," I corrected, my crest flattening in mild confusion. "The ambassador's remains have been moved to the medical bay for cryopreservation, as per Grawl tradition." "No," she said, her storm-gray eyes fixed on mine. Take me to where he died, the airlock. The journey through the pristine corridors of Nexus Station was silent. I offered several times to provide contextual information about the station's political climate, the stalled trade negotiations over crystalline catalysts, the Graal's territorial dispute with the Cathar hive, the philosophical schism with the silicon-based Xylos, but she seemed entirely uninterested. She simply walked, her gait smooth and economical, her head on a subtle, constant swivel. She wasn't looking at the other beings we passed, the floating Xylos prismatics or the skittering Cathar drones. She was watching the spaces between them. She was observing the flow of traffic, the angles of the corridor junctions, the placement of the ventilation shafts. When we arrived at the cordoned-off section, she ducked under the security tape without a word. I followed, my 4 lower limbs skittering nervously on the deck. The phantom cold was still there. Mara Vex did not approach the airlock itself. Instead, she stood in the center of the corridor, about 10 meters away, and closed her eyes. I stood frozen, unsure of the protocol for this procedure. Was this some kind of human meditative practice? A psionic scan? My people had no concept of such things. We relied on data, on the tangible and the measurable. Her stillness was absolute. It was more than just a lack of movement. It was a profound absence of wasted energy. A Graal would have stood ponderously. A Xylos would have hovered in perfect equilibrium. But Mara Vex was still in the way. A stalking feline is still right before the pounce. Every muscle fiber seemed to be held in a state of perfect, patient readiness. "Tell me about the Graal," she said, her eyes still closed. The question was so jarringly out of place that my vocal modulator produced a feedback squelch. Ambassador Zoran, he was the senior diplomat for the conglomerate, a decorated veteran of the Outer Rim skirmishes. He was known for his rigid adherence to tradition and him, she interrupted, her voice a soft rumble. "The species, what are they? Where do they come from?" "The Graal hail from Graalnar, a high-gravity world with a dense, nitrogen-rich atmosphere," I recited, accessing my internal data files. "They are a reptilian species, ectothermic with a slow metabolism. Their society is built on a complex caste system and a code of honor that predates their spacefaring age. They value strength, legacy, and immovable tradition. In a negotiation, they are famously intractable, viewing compromise as a form of defeat. Predators? No, not in the traditional sense," I replied. "Graalnar's fauna is largely sessile. The Graal evolved as competitive grazers, if you will. Their strength is for competing with each other, for defending territory from rival clans. They are herbivores." Mara Vex opened her eyes. The focus in them was so intense it felt like a physical pressure. She turned her head slowly, taking in the entire corridor, the bulkhead, the ceiling conduits, the floor panels, and the Cathar, she asked. "Insectoid hive mind. Their ambassador, Cathar Prime, is a nexus consciousness for the local swarm. They are pragmatic to the extreme. The individual has no value, only the hive matters. Their expansion is relentless but logical. They seek resources, not conquest for its own sake. Predators? Of a sort," I admitted. "They consume entire biospheres but not through active hunting. It is more akin to a geological process. They are industrial omnivores." She nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible motion. She walked to the airlock door, finally, and ran a gloved hand over its surface. She did not seem to be searching for prints or tool marks. Her touch was light, inquisitive, as if she were trying to understand the nature of the metal itself. Then, for the first time, I saw it. A flicker at the corner of her mouth. It was gone in an instant, but it was unmistakably the beginning of a smile. It was the most incongruous expression I had ever witnessed. Here, at the site of a brutal, inexplicable murder, this human investigator was smiling. It wasn't a smile of warmth or humor. It was something else entirely, something sharp and knowing and to my prey-species sensibilities deeply, deeply alarming. "No puzzle here," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I asked, my crest quivering with anxiety. "The logs, the seals, the physics of it." "Physics are irrelevant," she said, turning away from the airlock. Her eyes swept past me and settled on the far end of the corridor. "They're looking at the lock. But the kill didn't happen at the lock." She tapped a finger against her temple. "It happened in here. The prey was already dead before it ever reached the trap." My mind raced, trying to parse her words through a filter of logic and reason. Prey, trap, was this a metaphor? A human idiom I didn't understand. But the look in her eyes was not metaphorical. It was the look of an ecologist studying a food chain, a hunter reading tracks in the mud. Over the next 2 rotations, my confusion deepened into a kind of intellectual vertigo. Mara Vex's investigation followed no procedure I could recognize. She requisitioned the station's architectural schematics, but she ignored the security grids and focused on the life support systems. Specifically, the atmospheric mixing and filtration ducts. She interviewed the primary suspects, Zoran's political rivals and aggrieved subordinates. But she didn't ask about alibis or motives. Her meeting with Yorgal, Zoran's Grawl second-in-command, was a masterclass in psychological disruption. Yorgal was blustering, full of righteous fury and demanding justice. He spoke of honor and retribution. Mara let him speak for almost 10 minutes, her face a mask of placid stillness. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Was he strong, Yorgal? Was Zoran still strong? Or was his hide getting thin? Was his grip on tradition beginning to slip? Yorgal's brownish scales flushed a dark, angry purple. Zoran was the strength of the conglomerate. To question his honor is the armor of the strong, Mara said, her voice cutting through his tirade. But it's a heavy burden for the weak, easy to get trapped inside it. Easy to become so focused on defending your territory that you don't notice when the climate is changing around you. She left the interview then, leaving a sputtering, incandescently furious Grawl in her wake. I followed her out, my mind reeling. Inquisitor Vex, I managed, my limbs feeling unsteady. That line of questioning, it was deliberately provocative. You have potentially alienated a key ally in this investigation. Yorgal didn't kill him, she said, not breaking stride. Grawl don't kill like this. A Grawl would have challenged Zoran to a formal duel, crushed his skull with a ceremonial cudgel. They would have left a body, a statement. This was not a statement. This was pest control, pest control. The phrase sent a shiver through my carapace. We were no longer investigating a murder. We were in a different narrative entirely. Her interview with Cathar Prime was even stranger. The Nexus consciousness communicated via a modulated carrier wave, its voice a dissonant, multi-layered chorus. It floated in its nutrient tank, a mass of pulsating ganglia and iridescent nerve clusters. Death of the Grawl unit is inefficient, the hive mind droned. It has disrupted critical supply chain negotiations. Mara ignored the statement. She walked around the tank, peering at the swirling biomass within. A single drone, she said. If it is damaged or becomes unproductive, what does the hive do? It is recycled, Cathar Prime responded without hesitation. Its biomass is reclaimed for the greater good of the Cathar. It's not a punishment. There's no malice in it. Malice is an inefficient expenditure of energy. The calculation is simple, the cost of the unit versus its continued utility. When the cost exceeds the utility, the unit is removed. And you would apply that logic to other species? Mara asked, her voice dangerously soft. Logic is universal, the hive mind chorused. All systems seek equilibrium. The Grawl unit was an obstacle to equilibrium. Its removal, while currently disruptive, may prove to be a net benefit to the system as a whole. I expected Mara to press, to ask for clarification, for an admission of guilt. Instead, she just nodded, that same sharp, knowing look in her eyes. And again I saw the ghost of that terrifying smile. She had gotten what she came for, but it wasn't a confession. It was a confirmation of a behavioral model. She was mapping the instincts of every species on the station. Frustrated and feeling utterly useless, I retreated to my private data node. My Cygnian mind craved order, data, and verifiable facts. Mara Vex operated on none of those things. She was an intuitive creature, and her intuition was alien to me. If I was to be of any use, I had to understand the source of that intuition. I had to understand the human. I bypassed my diplomatic access codes and dove deep into the Terran Confederacy's public archives. I didn't look for criminology or investigative techniques. On a hunch born from her own strange methods, I looked for something more fundamental. I pulled up files on pre-spaceflight Earth. I delved into their planetary science, their biology, their paleontology. And that is where I found it. The data was overwhelming, a litany of planetary violence I could barely comprehend. Tectonic upheaval, planet-freezing ice ages, asteroid impacts. Life on Earth did not simply exist, it endured. It survived extinction-level events on a regular basis. And from this crucible of chaos arose its fauna. My own world, Cygnus X1, was a paradise of stability. Its evolution was a gentle, sprawling tapestry of cooperation and symbiosis. Earth's evolution was a bloody, relentless arms race. For every herbivore that developed thicker armor, a carnivore evolved a sharper tooth. For every creature that learned to run faster, a predator learned to hunt with greater stamina. I watched holographic recordings, my crest flattened in horror and fascination. I saw creatures called wolves, operating in packs, systematically exhausting prey many times their own size. They didn't rely on overwhelming strength, but on strategy, communication, and relentless, soul-crushing persistence. I saw great cats that were masters of ambush, capable of a stillness so profound they became invisible. They were patient hunters, waiting for the perfect moment, the single instant of weakness before they struck. And then I watched the records of early humanity. Small, soft, and slow compared to the megafauna they shared their world with. By all rights, they should have been a footnote in the fossil record, a quick meal for a larger beast. But they weren't. They didn't have the sharpest claws or the thickest hides. They had something else. They had forward-facing eyes, granting them the supreme depth perception necessary for throwing a spear or sighting a bow. They had a physical structure built not for sprinting, but for endurance, the ability to pursue, to track, to simply outlast their prey over vast distances. Persistence hunting, the files called it. They would chase an animal until it collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke. They didn't just kill their prey, they deconstructed it psychologically, piece by piece, until its will to live simply evaporated. They were pack hunters. They were ambush predators. They were persistence hunters. They hadn't just survived their violent world, they had mastered every predatory niche it had to offer. They had become the thing that everything else feared. They were the apex. I switched off the archive viewer, the ambient light of my quarters feeling dim and menacing. I thought of Mara Vex's forward-facing eyes, her unnatural stillness, her economical, ground-covering gait, her ability to psychologically unbalance her quarry. The way she smiled when she recognized a pattern of behavior she understood on a level deeper than intellect. My entire understanding of the universe shifted on its axis. We, the Galactic Council, the civilized species of the galaxy, had been operating under a flawed premise. We saw humans as chaotic, emotional, unpredictable newcomers. We had been trying to understand them as diplomats, as politicians, as allies or rivals. We had been classifying the wolf as a strange and noisy sheep. Mara Vex was not an investigator. She was a hunter, set loose in an ecosystem filled with creatures that had forgotten what a true predator looked like. And the murder of Ambassador Zoran was not a crime to be solved. It was a kill site to be analyzed. I finally understood. And my 6 limbs trembled. Armed with this terrifying new paradigm, I sought out Mara Vex. I found her not in an office or a lab, but in the station's arboretum. It was a vast, domed chamber filled with flora from 100 worlds, a testament to galactic cooperation. She was standing before a Terran exhibit, a small, enclosed habitat containing a recreation of an ancient Earth rainforest. Moss clung to the branches of immense ferns, and the air was thick with the scent of damp soil and decay. She was watching a holographic projection of a jaguar, the great cat I had seen in the archives, as it moved through the undergrowth. Its movements are silent, I transmitted, my voice subdued. It conserves energy until the final moment. Mara didn't turn, she just watched the hologram. It understands its environment, it knows every shadow, every sound, every scent. It doesn't just live in the jungle, it is the jungle. The jungle's teeth and claws are not looking for a murderer, I said, the words feeling heavy and dangerous. You are looking for another hunter. She finally turned to face me. Her storm-gray eyes held no surprise, only a flicker of something that might have been respect. Most species out here, she said, her voice a low murmur, are prey. They think in terms of defense, of reaction. They build walls, they write laws. They create protocols. They believe that if they make the rules strong enough, the predators can't get in. Zoran was in his fortress, I affirmed. The airlock was his wall. Exactly, Mara said. And the killer knew that. So it didn't try to break down the wall, it made the fortress itself the weapon. She began to walk, and I fell into step beside her. We left the arboretum, our footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. You have been studying the atmospheric controls, I stated. Zoran was Graal, she replied. Reptilian, ectothermic. His comfort, his health, his very thought processes are intrinsically linked to his environment. He would notice a 1-degree temperature fluctuation the way I would notice a knife at my throat. He would be sensitive to the slightest change in atmospheric pressure or nitrogen content. A horrifying clarity began to dawn in my mind. The killer, they did not need to get to him. No, Mara confirmed. They just needed to make him want to go somewhere specific, somewhere he wouldn't want to make a public fuss about. She gestured to a small, unmarked panel on the wall. Station schematics. Every primary system has tertiary manual overrides for emergency situations. They're shielded, locked, and rarely used. There's one for the atmospheric regulators in the Graal habitation block. It's located in a small maintenance conduit right next to airlock 7. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a closing trap. The killer introduced a minute, almost undetectable contaminant into Zoran's private quarters through the ventilation system. I deduced, my voice a stunned whisper. Something only a Graal would find distressing. Not toxic, not dangerous, but wrong. A subtle change in air pressure. A trace element that triggered an ancestral aversion. It would have felt like his territory was being violated, Mara continued, her eyes gleaming with cold appreciation for the strategy. But it was too subtle to raise a public alarm. That would be a show of weakness, an admission that his fortress was compromised. Graal honor would demand he investigated himself. Quietly, discreetly. He would check the main system logs from his console, I reasoned, and find nothing. The change was too small to be flagged as an anomaly, so his suspicion would fall on a hardware malfunction at the source. He would go to the manual override, to the maintenance conduit beside the airlock. Conduit is small, Mara said. Cramped. The killer tampered with the panel, rigging it to release a fast-acting neurotoxin when accessed. Not a lethal dose, just enough to paralyze. A Graal is heavy. Zoran collapses. He's right next to the airlock's emergency cycle panel. The killer, wearing a sealed environment suit, emerges from a nearby hiding spot. They don't need to hack the system. They just use the emergency purge. The logs are wiped by the emergency protocol. The whole process takes less than 30 seconds. No witnesses, no digital trail. No forced entry. She stopped and looked at me. The prey was lured out of its den and into a snare. It's a classic hunting technique. You don't fight the beast in its cave. You make the cave feel unsafe. My mind was a maelstrom. It was brilliant, it was diabolical, and it was utterly, terrifyingly predatory. Who, I managed to ask, who thinks like that? Mara finished my question for me. Who views a political assassination not as a crime of passion or greed, but as a calculated culling? Who would sacrifice one unit to ensure the survival of the whole? Who told us to our faces that they saw the ambassador's removal as a net benefit to the system? Cathar Prime, I breathed, the hive mind, the industrial omnivores, the logical, dispassionate recyclers of biomass. It wasn't an act of war, it was resource management. Zoran was blocking a treaty that would grant the Cathar access to the resource-rich Vale Nebula. The Graal saw it as an encroachment on their ancestral territory. For the Cathar, it was a matter of survival for trillions of drones. Zoran wasn't a person, he was a faulty component. There is no evidence, I stated, the old, logical part of my brain reasserting itself. No physical proof that links them to the conduit, the toxin, or the plan. Is for prey, Mara said, her voice flat. Proof is a rule. This wasn't about rules. This is about understanding the nature of the beast. Proceeded to the Cathar ambassadorial suite. The guards, tall, four-armed insectoids, tried to block our path, but Mara moved with such quiet authority that they simply stepped aside. Inside, Cathar Prime floated in its tank, the Nexus consciousness observing our approach with unnerving calm. Mara Vex did not present her theory. She did not make accusations. She stood before the tank, her hands clasped behind her back, and she began to speak. "There is a spider on my homeworld," she said, her voice resonating softly in the quiet chamber. "A trapdoor spider. It does not spin a web. It digs a burrow and covers the entrance with a perfectly camouflaged door of silk and soil. It holds the door shut and waits, feeling for the vibrations of prey walking overhead. It does not chase. It does not fight in the open. It makes its own territory the most dangerous place for its victim to be. It is patient. It is efficient. And when it strikes, there is no struggle, only a sudden absence." The multi-layered voice of Cathar Prime filled the room. "A fascinating biological analog. The universe repeats its patterns." "Yes, it does," Mara said, and then slowly, deliberately, she smiled. It was not the fleeting, ghostly smile from the crime scene. This one was fully formed. It was wide and it showed her teeth. On a Cygnian, baring one's mandibles is a sign of extreme aggression. On a human, I now understood it was infinitely more complex. This smile was not aggression. It was not joy. It was not satisfaction at having solved a puzzle. It was recognition. It was the predator at the apex of one ecosystem looking at the predator at the apex of another and seeing a reflection. It was a shared, silent, and utterly terrifying understanding of the universe. A universe that was not governed by laws or treaties, but by the cold, hard calculus of the hunt. "The Grawl will demand retribution," Cathar Prime stated, its voice devoid of emotion. "The Council will demand sanctions. This outcome is inefficient." "Are correct," Mara agreed, her smile never wavering. "An open conflict would be a waste of resources for everyone. A new equilibrium must be established." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "The Cathar will withdraw their claim on the Veil Nebula, immediately and permanently. You will issue a public statement citing unforeseen environmental hazards. You will also pay a significant indemnity to the Grawl conglomerate as a gesture of goodwill for their tragic loss." The liquid in the tank swirled faster. "That is an unacceptable outcome. We lose the resources and we demonstrate weakness. The alternative," Mara said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "is that I present my findings to the Council. Not my proof, of which I have none, but my analysis. My understanding of your nature." She took a step closer to the tank. "I will explain to the Grawl, the Xylos, the Cygnian, and all the others exactly what you are. I will translate your logic into a language they can understand. The language of the trapdoor spider. The language of the silent, patient hunter who sacrifices the few to feed the many." She leaned in, her face just inches from the glass. "Do you know what prey animals do when they finally, truly understand the nature of the predator that lives among them? They don't just build stronger walls. They learn to hunt too. The Grawl will not seek sanctions. They will seek extermination. The rest of the Council, out of fear, will help them. You will have turned a galaxy of scattered, bickering herbivores into a single, unified pack of hunters, and they will have a single target. Your hive." The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000,000 minds performing a single, cold calculation. "The Veil Nebula contains unforeseen environmental hazards," the hive mind finally chorused, its voice flat and defeated. "We will prepare the indemnity." Mara Vex simply nodded, her smile fading back into that unnerving stillness. She turned and walked out of the room. I stood there for a moment, my mind trying to process the scale of what had just happened. She had won. With no evidence, no threats of violence, no legal leverage. She had won by holding up a mirror and forcing the Cathar to see their own reflection in the eyes of their prey. And she had shown them that their greatest strength, their cold, predatory logic, was also their greatest vulnerability. I followed her back into the corridor. The station felt different now. The clean, sterile environment felt thin, like a fragile sheet of ice over a dark, deep ocean. Every species I looked at, I now saw in a new light. I saw the herd instincts, the defensive posturing, the skittishness of prey. And I looked at Mara Vex, this small, soft-fleshed being from a world of unimaginable violence, and I finally understood her smile. It was the smile of a zookeeper who had just put 2 rival carnivores back in their proper enclosures. It was the smile of a chess master who sees the entire board, not just the individual pieces. But it was more than that. It was the smile of belonging. Here, in a galaxy filled with beings who had evolved beyond such things, the Cathar had committed a perfect, rational, predatory act. They had spoken a language that had been dead for millennia on most worlds, and Mara Vex was the only one in the galaxy who was fluent. Her smile was not about the murder. It was about the validation. It proved that humanity's bloody, brutal history was not a source of shame to be overcome, but a resource of unparalleled value. In a civilized galaxy, everyone had forgotten the rules of the wild. Everyone except for the humans. The Council will be pleased with the resolution, I said, my voice modulator struggling to maintain an even tone. You have averted a war. For now, she said, her gaze distant. The galaxy is a very large ecosystem. There are always more hunters. She looked at me then, and her gray eyes were not cold or predatory. They were filled with a profound and ancient weariness. And in that moment, I understood the final, terrible truth. Humanity hadn't just mastered every form of predation. They had also, somehow, learned to live with the chilling knowledge of what they were. They were the apex predators who had looked into the void and instead of being terrified had recognized the darkness within themselves. We walked on in silence. I, a being of logic and reason, and she, a creature of instinct and shadow. We were allies, partners in a galactic order that I now knew was a fragile illusion. And I wondered, with a fear that settled deep in my core, what would happen on the day the galaxy decided it no longer needed a zookeeper. What happens when the apex predator decides it is tired of maintaining the cages? The future of our stars felt terrifyingly, uncertainly open.